The next tab we have on the hair object is for fill hairs. With the fill hair, you have a checkbox to enable or disable fill hairs, and you have a count to specify how many fill hairs you're going to add to the scene. So what is a fill hair? In general, what we have are guides. And then we have the hair tab here, which generates hair that is interpolated between the guides. Now, fill hairs were implemented so that we could actually take the hairs that are generated from the guides and then interpolate hair between those. So in this instance, if I go to the guides, you'll see that I have 50 guides set to polygon area. If I go to the hairs tab and check out the roots, I have the hairs set to as guides. So in this case, each guide that you see in the screen right now will render as an individual hair. And if we go into the hair material and find the thickness, we can adjust the thickness just so we can see this a bit better in the viewport here. And so we'll try out those values there and render, and you can see that we have a little bit thicker hair. If we go back to the hair object and find our fill hairs, let's go ahead and activate fill hairs. So at the moment it's going to add 40,000 fill hairs, and essentially this is just going to take each hair in my scene and interpolate hairs in between it. So if we click render, you'll see the results that we get. With this render, you can see some of the issues with the fill hairs, or maybe not an issue, but just something that really shows how it's only interpolating between the hairs. So in this case, since I just had one hair here and one hair here, the fill hairs interpolate directly between those two hairs. If I was to go back to the hairs tab and set the roots to something like polygon area, the hairs are smart enough to know that they're still supposed to try to distribute themselves along the entire polygon object. Fill hairs aren't really that smart. So what are fill hairs useful for then? Well, before systems came packed with a ton of RAM and stuff like that, you may have needed a way to get thicker, more luscious looking hair without totally killing your system. And fill hairs were a great way of doing that because you could add in the hair. And since it wasn't as smart as the normal hair that's generated, it's kind of like a dumb proxy object that's put in between there, you didn't need as much memory to render. But there are even more things that kind of help to affect that. In the advanced drop-down here, you'll see that you have a lot of different options for how to control your fill hairs. If you remember the cloning tab in the hairs, that would be this one right here, we have options for scale, variation, and stuff like that. And this is going to affect the scale of the clones based off of the actual hair that it was being cloned off of. Fill hairs have similar options for scale with variation and thickness with variation. So what this means is if I render right now, all of my hairs come in at the same height, and they match my original hairs really well. So you don't notice that there are fill hairs in there amongst my actual hairs. If I set the scale to 50% and render again, you'll see that I have these tiny little spikes every once in a while, and those are my original hairs, and then all of the fill hairs here are 50% of the length of that original hair. And if we zoom in closer and maybe take a look like this, you can see that better. So here we have all the original hairs, and everything underneath those are the fill hairs. We can add variation to this, just so that we get something that looks a little bit more natural. Like with the scale, we also have thickness. Let's set the scale back to 100% with 0 variation. With the thickness, we'll set this to 50% and click on render. And we get a pretty solid wall. So let's take a look from above and see if we can get a better idea of how the thickness is changing. And we'll probably want to focus on a specific area, like right here. So in this case, maybe 50% still isn't showing a good value, or our hair material is not thick enough. So we can take the thickness down even further. Let's go 10%. And with 10%, you can really see the effect here. So we have a nice thick line, and those thick lines are going to be the original hairs. And all of these little thin lines here are the fill hairs. Again, we do have an option to add in variation, so if we set 10% there and render, you'll see that we get something that looks a little bit more natural. Next we have an option here for clumping, and what clumping is the ability to have your hairs that are being generated, or in this case fill hairs that are being generated, gravitate towards your original hairs. So if we click on clump, and then render, you'll see how all of the fill hairs are gravitating towards my original hairs. Now this causes a really linear kind of clump. So to work around this linear path from the base of the fill hair to the tip of your original hair, you have a spline graph. And in the spline graph, what we're currently seeing is a linear path. And that's being mirrored by the hair itself. If we adjust the attraction on the left side here, and then click on render, you'll see how the fill hairs kind of try to stretch to the base of the guide hair right away. So they're attracted very strongly to the base of the hair. And if we find something that's kind of in between and then render, you can see how you can start to build a curve for this edge that was being created. Now this still isn't looking the exact way that we would want. So really with the attraction, we probably want to keep this at 0. And then we can add in points on the spline graph, and you may have to twirl down your advanced options here and reduce the tension so that you get a nice smooth curve. And then you probably don't want all of the tips of your fill hairs touching together. So you'd want to kind of pull this down a little bit so that they're going to maintain a bit of distance from the tip. If you render again, you'll see that you get something that is a little bit closer to the type of clumping of hair you would want. This curve still might be going the wrong direction, so we can just take this knot here and try adjusting it like that, and then click render again. And now they kind of bow out before they clump together. So really, you can take this spline graph here and adjust this to your needs for these clumping hairs. Finally, we have a couple of checkboxes that allow you to affect how the fill hairs are going to render in your scene. The first one actually affects the real hairs, but it is contained inside of the fill hair tab. So what this checkbox allows you to do is render only the fill hairs. If I click on render, you'll see that we get our fill hairs that are clumping around the original hair. And the original hair is the thicker line that you see on the screen. If I check fill hairs only and then render, what it's going to do is remove all of the original hairs from the scene and only show me the fill hairs that are being interpolated between the original hairs. Now I've added a light into my scene that's casting shadows, and you can see that right here. If we click on render, not a whole lot is going on. And the reason for that is because of these options right here. First of all, the fill hairs only is checked, so I'm not seeing my original hairs. And this shadows box here is used to enable or disable if the fill hairs are going to be able to cast shadows. So with the box unchecked, the fill hairs currently do not cast any shadows. If we uncheck fill hairs only so that the original hair renders and click render, you'll see that I'm getting a render where the original hair is casting a shadow, but the fill hairs don't cast any. The reason for this option is a lot of the times you would have enough actual hairs in the scene that you wouldn't really notice a difference with the fill hairs not casting shadows. So by allowing the fill hairs to not cast shadows, you're saving a lot of memory and a little bit of time that you would have to put into calculating those shadows for the fill hairs. So just to show you what it does look like with the shadows turned on, we can click on the shadows, and you'll notice the last render here was 1 second long. If we click on the render button again, you'll see that now it having to calculate those extra shadow maps just for the fill hairs really slows down the render. But you can definitely see that each one of those fill hairs is casting shadows now. Lastly, there's the cache checkbox, and what this is going to do is take the resulting shadow map that is created from the fill hair shadows, and it's going to cache that in memory. So it's going to use up more memory, but it does offer the possibility of speeding up your render times.